The year is 1893. A black and white photograph sits in an archive showing an anatomy theater at Boston Medical College. Professor Edmund Wright stands at the center, presiding over a cadaver on a dissection table. Medical students crowd around him, their faces eager and attentive. The image is stark, clinical, a window into 19th century medical education. For over a century, this photograph remained filed away, just another piece of historical documentation. It was a photo that was found, catalogued, and forgotten. That is, until someone examined the background. Miguel Torres is a digital archivist working for the Massachusetts Historical Society. In the spring of 2023, he began a routine project to scan and preserve glass plate negatives from the defunct Boston Medical College archives. The task seemed straightforward enough. Document 19th century medical education, digitize the collection, make it accessible to researchers. But when Miguel began scanning this particular photograph at high resolution, he noticed something that had gone undetected for 130 years. A detail so small, so easy to miss, that it would unravel a dark mystery that had haunted Boston's elite for generations. The photograph itself has an interesting history. It was discovered by Braden Chen, a junior archivist, in a mislabeled storage box. The box was supposed to contain botanical slides from the college's Natural Sciences department. Instead, Braden found dozens of glass plate negatives documenting medical procedures, anatomy lessons, and surgical demonstrations. This particular image was near the bottom of the stack, its label long since deteriorated. Braden flagged it for the digitization project, noting only that it appeared to be from the early 1890s based on the clothing and photographic techniques visible in the image. Miguel set up the photograph for scanning in late March of 2023. The glass plate negative was in remarkable condition considering its age. He used a specialized scanner capable of capturing images at extremely high resolution, far beyond what the human eye could perceive when looking at the original plate. This technology allows archivists to examine historical photographs in ways that would have been impossible when they were first created. Dust particles invisible to the naked eye become clear. Faint details and shadows emerge. Reflections and textures that seem like mere noise in the original image can be isolated and enhanced. As Miguel began the digital restoration process, removing digital artifacts and cleaning up the scan, he zoomed in to check the focus on various parts of the image. That is when he saw it. Behind the students, slightly out of focus but still visible, there is a surgical tray. The tray holds the expected instruments: scalpels with ivory handles, forceps in various sizes, bone saws with serrated edges. But among these medical tools, there is something that does not belong. The object is made of metal, approximately 6 inches long, with a curved blade and an ornately carved wooden handle. The design is precise and elegant, but it is not a surgical instrument. Miguel recognized it immediately. It is a leather working knife, specifically a skiving knife used by master craftsmen to thin and bevel leather edges. The tool is distinctive, custom-made, with decorative scrollwork on the handle that would have identified it to its owner. Miguel flagged the anomaly in his notes. Perhaps it was a simple mistake, a tool left behind by someone repairing a medical bag or bookbinding. But something about its placement nagged at him. The presence of the leather working knife made Miguel examine the entire photograph more carefully. He spent hours zooming into different sections of the image, looking for other details that might have been overlooked. His attention eventually moved to the far wall of the anatomy theater, where a tall glass-fronted cabinet stands barely visible in the background. The cabinet would have held specimens, medical texts, or demonstration materials. The lighting in the photograph, natural light from tall windows, hits the glass at a particular angle. There's a faint reflection on the surface of the cabinet door. At normal resolution, it appears to be nothing more than a smudge or imperfection in the glass. But at the high resolution Miguel was working with, he could see that the reflection had structure. There were shapes, possibly faces. He knew he needed help. Miguel contacted Tyler Morrison, a forensic analyst who specializes in digital image enhancement for law enforcement. Tyler had worked on several cold cases, using modern technology to extract details from old photographs and security footage. Miguel sent him the specific section of the image containing the glass cabinet reflection. Tyler spent 3 days working on the enhancement, using multiple software programs to isolate the reflection, adjust contrast, and clarify the distorted shapes. What he sent back to Miguel was startling. The enhanced reflection shows 2 distinct elements. The first is the face of Professor Edmund Wright. In the main photograph, Wright appears professional and composed, the very image of an academic physician. But in the reflection, his face is turned slightly toward the camera, and his expression is completely different. There is no scholarly detachment. Instead, his features show something that can only be described as cold triumph, a satisfaction that seems at odds with the solemn nature of an anatomy lesson. The second element in the reflection is even more significant. Standing next to the photographer, just outside the frame of the main image, is another figure. This person is not visible in the primary photograph at all. They exist only in this reflected moment, captured by accident when the light struck the glass just right. The figure is dressed in expensive clothing, clearly not a medical student or faculty member. The style suggests wealth and social standing. A tailored coat, a high collar, a watch chain visible across the vest. This is someone of importance, someone who was present for this anatomy lesson but chose not to appear in the official photograph. Miguel immediately reached out to Peter Ashford, a local historian who specializes in Boston's Gilded Age. Peter has spent decades researching the city's prominent families, its institutions, and the often hidden scandals that shaped its development. Miguel sent him everything: the photograph, the enhanced reflection, the details about the leather working knife. He asked Peter to provide context on Professor Edmund Wright and to search historical records from around the time the photograph was likely taken. Peter's response arrived 2 weeks later, and it was extensive. Professor Edmund Wright was a celebrated figure in Boston medical circles during the late 19th century. He had trained in Edinburgh and Paris before establishing himself at Boston Medical College in 1885. His lectures were famous for their clarity, and his dissections were considered masterful demonstrations of anatomical knowledge. But Peter's research revealed something else. There were rumors about Wright, whispers that circulated among his colleagues and competitors. The concern was about his supply of cadavers. In the 1890s, acquiring bodies for medical study was a persistent challenge. Legal sources were limited. Unclaimed bodies from poorhouses and prisons were the primary supply, and they were never enough to meet the demand from medical schools. This scarcity had given rise to the resurrection men, grave robbers who stole freshly buried bodies and sold them to anatomists. It was a grim but accepted reality of medical education. But Wright never seemed to have supply problems. His anatomy theater always had fresh specimens. His demonstrations never had to be canceled or postponed. Some of his colleagues praised his resourcefulness. Others were suspicious. Accusations of impropriety were floated but never substantiated. Wright's patrons were wealthy and influential, and any investigations were quickly dropped. The rumors were dismissed as professional jealousy. Peter suggested that Miguel look at something else. He asked Miguel to search newspaper archives from the spring of 1893, roughly 6 months before and after the likely date of the photograph. Miguel spent a week combing through digitized records from the Boston Globe, the Boston Herald, and several smaller local papers. What he found was disturbing. In March of 1893, a series of disappearances began that would grip the city with fear. These were not typical missing persons cases. The victims were not transients or individuals who might have chosen to leave town unnoticed. They were established members of the community, people whose absences were immediately noted and investigated. The first disappearance was Camden Price, a master leather worker whose shop on Beacon Hill was known throughout New England. Camden was 42 years old, unmarried, and devoted to his craft. He created custom leather goods for Boston's wealthiest families: saddles, book bindings, travel cases, and specialty items that required the highest level of skill. He was particularly known for the tools he made for himself, custom blades and knives that he designed specifically for different leather working techniques. On March 14, 1893, Camden failed to open his shop. His apprentice found the workshop locked from the inside. When police forced entry, there was no sign of struggle, but Camden was gone. His tools were scattered across his workbench as if he had been interrupted mid-task. Several of his custom knives were missing. The case baffled investigators. Camden had no debts, no enemies, no reason to flee. He simply vanished. 3 weeks later, on April 7, 1893, a second disappearance occurred. Zachary Pemberton was a visiting nobleman from England in Boston for what he described to his hotel staff as private business matters. Zachary was 35 years old, charming, and conspicuously wealthy. He had arrived in February and taken a suite at the Parker House Hotel. He was seen regularly at social events, the theater, and private clubs. On the evening of April 7th, he left the hotel telling the desk clerk he had an appointment. He never returned. His belongings remained in his room. His luggage was packed as if he had been planning to extend his stay. Police investigated, but found no leads. The British consulate pressured local authorities, but Zachary Pemberton had simply ceased to exist. The third disappearance was the one that truly shocked Boston society. On May 2, 1893, Tatum Whitmore vanished. Tatum was 19 years old, the only daughter of Gideon Whitmore, one of Boston's wealthiest industrialists and philanthropists. Gideon had made his fortune in textiles and shipping, and he was a major benefactor to numerous institutions, including Boston Medical College. Tatum was educated, refined, and expected to make an advantageous marriage to solidify her family's social position. Her disappearance sparked a massive investigation. Rewards were offered, private detectives were hired, every lead was pursued, but Tatum was never found. The official theory was that she had been kidnapped for ransom, but no demand ever came. Gideon Whitmore was destroyed by the loss. He became reclusive, his public appearances rare and brief. The case remained open but went cold within months. Peter and Miguel began to connect these disappearances to the photograph. The timing was right. The photograph was dated to late spring of 1893 based on several factors. The students' clothing matched the fashion of that specific season. A calendar visible in the deep background showed a date in May. Newspaper clippings found with the glass plate negative referenced events from that month. If the photograph was taken in May of 1893, it fell right in the middle of this series of disappearances. But the connection was more than just timing. Miguel sent Peter a high-resolution crop of the leather working knife visible on the surgical tray. Peter took it to the Massachusetts Historical Society's research library, where he found the records of the Boston Guild of Leather Craftsmen. The guild kept detailed ledgers of its master members, including sketches of their signature tools and techniques. In the 1893 ledger, Peter found an entry for Camden Price. The sketch of Camden's custom skiving knife was unmistakable. The curved blade, the decorative scrollwork on the wooden handle, even the specific angle of the bevel matched perfectly. The knife in the photograph was Camden Price's tool. It was sitting on a surgical tray in an anatomy theater, 4 months after he disappeared. Miguel then turned his attention to the cadaver on the dissection table. In the photograph, the body is positioned face up, partially draped with cloth as was customary for the modesty of the era. But the face is visible, and the preservation is remarkable. This is not the typical state of bodies procured through legal channels. which were often in poor condition by the time they reached anatomy theaters. This body appears fresh, well preserved, almost as if the subject had died recently. Miguel used facial recognition software designed for forensic identification. He input measurements and proportions from the cadaver's face and compared them against every photograph and portrait he could find from the era. The match came back with a high probability. The cadaver on Professor Edmund Wright's table was Zachary Pemberton, the missing English nobleman. The features aligned. The age was right. Even the distinctive shape of the ears matched portraits that had been circulated during the search for the missing man. Peter then focused on the reflected figure in the glass cabinet, the mysterious observer who had been present during the anatomy lesson but had not appeared in the main photograph. Tyler had already done as much enhancement as possible, clarifying the face enough to show general features. Peter compared this enhanced reflection against hundreds of photographs and painted portraits of prominent Boston figures from the 1890s. The match was conclusive. The observer was Gideon Whitmore, Tatum's father, the wealthy benefactor whose donations had funded much of Boston Medical College's expansion, including Professor Wright's Anatomy Theater. The full picture began to emerge, horrifying in its implications. Peter discovered a cache of personal letters in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society. The letters had been donated by a distant Whitmore relative decades earlier and had never been fully catalogued or studied. Among them were several from May of 1893, written by Gideon Whitmore to his attorney. The letters revealed a family crisis. Tatum had not been kidnapped. She had eloped. Her chosen partner was Zachary Pemberton, the English nobleman. They had met at a winter social event and had been conducting a secret courtship. Zachary was charming and titled, but he was also nearly penniless, living on credit and charm. Gideon had discovered the relationship and forbidden it. He had plans for Tatum to marry the son of another industrial family, a match that would cement business alliances and social position. But Tatum defied him. The letters revealed Gideon's rage. He wrote that his daughter had betrayed not just him, but her entire family. He wrote that Zachary Pemberton was a fortune hunter, a parasite, unworthy of breathing the same air as a Whitmore. He wrote that he would handle the matter personally, and that no one would ever question his authority again. Peter and Miguel reconstructed what must have happened. Gideon Whitmore used his wealth and his influence over Professor Edmund Wright to orchestrate a murder. Wright was already operating outside the law, using resurrection men to procure bodies for his anatomy theater. But resurrection men were more than just grave robbers. They were criminals who dealt in bodies, and for the right price they could acquire fresh specimens through more direct means. Camden Price was likely the first victim, possibly taken as practice or because he had seen something he should not have. His distinctive tools were kept, perhaps, as trophies. Zachary Pemberton was the primary target. He was lured to an appointment, abducted, and killed. His body was delivered to Professor Wright's Anatomy Theater. Tatum's fate remains unknown, but the most likely scenario, given the evidence and the social mores of the time, is that she was either killed alongside Zachary or institutionalized in one of the private asylums that wealthy families used to hide inconvenient relatives. The anatomy lesson, photographed in May of 1893, was not an educational demonstration. It was a private performance, a bespoke act of revenge. Gideon Whitmore paid Professor Wright to dissect Zachary Pemberton while he watched. The photograph was proof of service, documentation that the task had been completed. Wright's triumphant expression in the reflection makes sense now. He had fulfilled a contract, eliminated a problem for his most important patron, and secured his own position. Gideon's presence, hidden from the main image but captured accidentally in reflection, confirms his role as the architect of this horror. The medical students in the photograph, smiling and attentive, were likely unaware of what they were truly witnessing. They saw an anatomy lesson. They did not see a murder. Miguel and Peter published their findings in the Journal of Historical Criminal Investigation in October of 2023. The article included all the evidence, the enhanced photographs, the historical records, the forensic analysis. The publication caused immediate controversy. Boston Medical College had closed in 1912, but its archives had been absorbed by several successor institutions. These institutions were forced to re-examine their collections. Additional photographs from the same era were analyzed. Records of cadaver procurement were studied. A pattern emerged. Professor Edmund Wright had likely been involved in multiple murders over his career, providing bodies to order for wealthy patrons who wanted specific individuals disappeared. The exact number will never be known, but researchers have identified at least 7 other suspicious cases between 1885 and 1900 that match the pattern. The Massachusetts Historical Society issued a formal statement acknowledging the dark chapter in Boston's medical history. The reputation of Professor Edmund Wright, once celebrated as a pioneer of anatomical education, has been thoroughly rewritten. He is now understood as a serial murderer who used his position to facilitate crimes for profit. Gideon Whitmore's legacy has also been re-evaluated. Buildings and endowments that bore his name have been renamed. His philanthropy is now understood as a means of buying influence and silence. The photograph itself remains in the archives, but it is no longer displayed as a simple historical curiosity. It is presented with full context, a testament to how images can hide crimes in plain sight for generations. Visitors who view it now see not just medical students and a professor, but a frozen moment of evil, a confession captured in glass and silver salts. The students in the foreground, unaware. The tools of murder on the tray, the triumphant killer and the watching patron reflected in glass. And on the table, a victim whose disappearance was never solved until someone examined the background. We study old photographs to understand the past, to see how people lived and worked and learned. But sometimes we are looking at evidence. Sometimes we are looking at a confession that waited over a century to be read. The 1893 anatomy photograph from Boston Medical College is no longer a window into medical education. It is a window into murder, revenge, and the way wealth and power can corrupt even the most respected institutions. And it raises an uncomfortable question. How many other photographs in museums and archives around the world are hiding similar secrets, waiting for someone to look closely enough at the background to enhance the reflection, to ask the difficult questions? History is not always what it appears to be in the foreground. Sometimes the truth is in the shadows, in the reflections, in the details we almost miss.